My wife's work was having a charity auction with different items that the co-workers and spouses could make. What I came up with was a simple walnut clock. I went to my local craft store and purchased a 2.5-inch clock movement. Then I put pen to paper and drew a rough sketch of what I wanted it to look like. I had an idea to make the feet for the clock over at the bandsaw, but more about that later. I took some 8-quarter walnut and started truing up the surfaces. My original plan was to have the top back of the clock have matching grain patterns. You'll see later why that didn't work out. I proceeded to put some glue on the pieces and clamp them together. Once I unclamped them, I took them over to the miter saw and started cutting off some of the excess material. When cutting off some of the material, a knot had presented itself that was hidden underneath the surface. That kind of threw a wrench in my plans. This was supposed to be the side bottom of the clock. I then had to change my plan slightly and make sure that this piece was going to get cut off on the back. I had to flip the piece over. In doing so, my grain match is now on the bottom instead of the top. I took a piece of hardboard and drilled 2 holes in it 2 inches apart to get my 4-inch diameter circle. The clock mechanism required a hole drilled at 2 3/8 inch diameter. I had a hole saw that was that size, so I proceeded to drill that hole. However, my largest Forstner bit was 2 inches, so I then removed the hole saw, installed the 2-inch Forstner bit to take out most of the material. You can see here the outer circle was with the hole saw, the inner circle with the Forstner bit. I then cleaned up the excess material with a chisel. I then took the blank over to the bandsaw and cut the top radius. I came up with this bandsaw feet idea a while back and I've been wanting to try it ever since. This seemed like the perfect project to try it out. My blank was roughly 4 inches by 4 inches squared. I drew lines on the bottom a 1/2 inch in from the edge. I also drew lines on the front, back, and sides 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom. I then picked an angle that looked good on my T-bevel and connected the lines. The idea was to cut these 4 lines out on the bandsaw, then hog away the material and be left with 4 feet. Oddly enough, when I was cutting the blank and it was on the inside of the bandsaw blade, the blade tracked nice and true. Once the blank was on the outside of the bandsaw blade, the blade wanted to wander quite a bit. I'm not sure if that's just how the wood was, or there was something in the technique that I was using to cut it, but keep this in mind if you decide to build something similar. I then came in at a steep angle to try and remove most of the bulk material. Take your time when doing this to try to avoid making mistakes, knowing that any inaccuracies would have to be dealt with sandpaper and a file. And trying to do this on end grain can be very difficult. If you own a 1-inch wide or similar belt sander, you could probably get in there and clean it up rather well. But I was stuck with hand tools. I got it to a point of good enough because that was going to be on the bottom and it wasn't going to be seen. Here you can see the knot that presented itself earlier. Remember, in layout, I had to flip the blank over so that the top was the bottom and the bottom was the top. So when I cut out the sweep on the back, the knot would be removed, which was kind of a bummer because I spent so much time lining up the grain pattern to be on the top. Then it was over to the belt sander and disc sander to take out some of the rough marks and to do some finish shaping. I applied a thin coat of spray lacquer, then sanded lightly with 320 grit paper and applied 3 more coats. The clock mechanism has a small rubber ring on its perimeter with little flexible tabs that give it a friction fit in the 2 3/8 inch hole. The time and the battery are changed by pulling out the mechanism and accessing the back of the movement. For those of you that may be newer to woodworking and you haven't worked with walnut yet, give it a try. It's a fairly easy wood to work with, and a clear finish really brings out the deep richness of the grain. You can still see some of my bandsaw marks on the bottom, but hey, it's the bottom. I think the grain in the walnut still turned out beautifully. But here from the back you can see that grain doesn't quite match up as originally planned, but it still turned out pretty nice. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.